I spent 3 months carving my father a chess set for his 60th birthday. Every piece was shaped by hand. Every detail sanded smooth in the quiet hours after midnight. The king bore the likeness of my grandfather, the man who first placed a chisel in my hand. It was the finest thing I had ever made. 3 months of patience, hope, and a lifetime of wanting to be seen. The next morning, I found it in the trash, still wrapped, the twine untouched, sitting on top of a pile of paper plates and crushed beer cans at the curb. Through the kitchen window, I saw my father at the table, sipping coffee. On his wrist gleamed the watch my brother had bought him, store-bought, effortless, admired. I didn't knock, I didn't speak. I picked up the box, placed it in my truck, and drove away without a word. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 34 years old. And this is the story of the moment I stopped trying to earn my father's love, not because I had nothing left to give, but because I finally realized I was pouring it into a container with no bottom. I grew up in a small town just outside Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains rose like quiet witnesses and everyone knew the sound of your truck before they knew your name. It was the kind of place where men were measured by the strength of their handshake and the calluses on their palms. My father, Richard Carter, fit that mold perfectly. Dad ran a contracting business he'd built from the ground up. He framed houses, poured foundations, and believed that anything worth having came from sweat and stubbornness. To him, love wasn't something you were given, it was something you earned. And if you didn't earn it, you didn't get it. Simple as that. My older brother, Brandon, was everything my father wanted in a firstborn. He was 3 years ahead of me, tall, broad-shouldered, and confident in a way that filled every room he walked into. Brandon didn't just understand Dad, he spoke his language. By the time he graduated high school, he was already working on job sites, swinging a hammer beside him. Within a few years, they were inseparable, running the business together like a two-man operation. They'd leave before sunrise, come home covered in dust, and spend dinner talking about permits, subcontractors, and load-bearing walls while I sat quietly, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate. My mother, Margaret, was kind in the way soft rain is kind, gentle, steady, and incapable of stopping a storm. She loved us fiercely, but she had a habit of smoothing things over instead of confronting them. If tension crept into the room, she'd sweep it aside with a smile or a casserole, determined to keep the peace even when peace meant silence. She wasn't cruel, she just believed harmony mattered more than honesty. And over the years, every unresolved conflict found a home beneath her careful rug. Then there was me. I was the quiet one, the son who preferred books to ball games, solitude to spotlights. I loved working with my hands, but not in the way my father understood. I didn't want to build houses. I wanted to carve stories out of wood. I discovered that love when I was 12 during a summer visit with my maternal grandfather, Walter Hayes. Grandpa Walter was a retired carpenter with silver hair, patient eyes, and a workshop that smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco. He taught me how to hold a chisel, how to read the grain, how to find the shape hiding inside a block of wood. Don't force it, he'd say. Listen to it. The wood already knows what it wants to be. I fell in love with the craft that summer. By 16, I was making pieces that impressed teachers, neighbors, and judges at local fairs. Jewelry boxes, carved figurines, decorative panels. It became my sanctuary, my quiet rebellion, and the only place I ever felt truly seen. Everyone appreciated it. Everyone except my father. Brandon would come home with a second-place football trophy, and Dad would clear a space for it on the mantel like it was a family heirloom. I'd come home with a blue ribbon from the state fair for a hand-carved eagle, and Dad would glance up from the television and say, "That's nice, son," before returning to the game. He wasn't cruel. He never mocked my work or told me to stop. He simply treated it like a phase, something I'd outgrow, like collecting baseball cards or building model airplanes. Meanwhile, Brandon's ambitions were treated like destiny. After high school, Brandon joined the family business full-time, learning the trade from Dad. Within a few years, they were partners in everything but name. They shared job sites, lunches, and laughter, bound together by a language of blueprints and measurements I could never quite speak. I left home at 18. I rented a small apartment, worked days at a hardware store, and carved at night beneath the glow of a single desk lamp. Slowly, I began selling pieces online and at local craft markets. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't lucrative at first, but it was mine, built not from expectation, but from purpose. Around that same time, I taught myself to play chess. I was drawn to its quiet strategy, the deliberate patience of each move. It became a meditation, A puzzle that rewarded thought over force. I played online, studied openings, lost countless games, and slowly improved, and somewhere along the way, my two passions merged. I began carving chess pieces. My first full set took nearly 2 months. The knights looked more like hounds than horses, and the bishops leaned slightly to one side. But I kept refining my craft. By the time I was 25, I was creating custom sets that sold for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. Collectors admired the detail, the balance, the patience etched into every piece. I built a modest following online. And for the first time, strangers saw value in something my father never truly noticed. I brought pieces to family dinners. I showed photographs of completed commissions. I talked about orders from collectors and galleries. Dad would offer a thin smile and say, "That's neat, Daniel. So, Brandon, how's the Henderson project coming along every single time?" It was like I was a commercial break between the parts of the show he actually wanted to watch. To his credit, Brandon never tried to be the favorite. He simply was. He followed in Dad's footsteps, carried his legacy forward, and gave him a son he could brag about over a beer. I spoke a different language, one carved in walnut and maple, and my father never bothered to learn it. Still, I kept trying. Every birthday, every Father's Day, every Christmas, I made him something: a carved picture frame, a decorative box for his desk, a wall-mounted coat rack with hand-cut details. He always thanked me politely. He always set them aside, and I never saw them displayed. Once, I found the coat rack in the garage behind a stack of paint cans, the picture frame turned up in a junk drawer. The box sat untouched on a shelf in the basement, still wrapped in the tissue paper I had placed inside it, but I told myself the same thing every time. Maybe the next one will be different. Maybe the next one will be the one that finally makes him see me. If you grow up in a house where love feels conditional, you learn early how to measure your worth in silence. Not in what is said, but in what isn't. I don't remember a single moment when my father openly dismissed my work. He never told me to stop carving, never laughed at what I made, never forbade me from pursuing it. In many ways, that would have been easier to understand. At least, cruelty is honest. What I lived with was something quieter, something harder to name. Indifference. The kind that erodes you slowly, grain by grain, like water wearing down stone. When Brandon scored touchdowns, my father stood in the bleachers with his chest out, shouting himself hoarse. He framed newspaper clippings and hung them beside the mantel. When Brandon brought home awards from trade school, Dad invited the neighbors over to celebrate, retelling the story like it was family lore. When I brought home a blue ribbon from the state fair for a hand-carved eagle, 6 weeks of work distilled into wings and feathered precision, he glanced at it, nodded, and said, "That's nice, son." Before turning back to the television, that was the pattern. Brandon's achievements were milestones, mine were footnotes. At dinner, the conversation revolved around construction schedules, subcontractors, and job site mishaps. Dad and Brandon spoke in shorthand: numbers, measurements, jargon I understood, but was never invited to share. I'd sit there quietly, pushing food across my plate while their laughter filled the room. Occasionally, my mother would try to include me. "Daniel got an A on his English paper," she'd say gently. Dad would nod without looking up. "Good job." Then he'd turn back to Brandon. "So, how's the Henderson build coming along?" And just like that, I was gone again. It wasn't cruelty. That was the hardest part. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who simply didn't see me. You can't resent someone for what they never acknowledge, but you can spend a lifetime trying to change it. I kept believing that if I made something extraordinary, something undeniable, he would finally look at me the way he looked at Brandon. So, I poured myself into my craft with quiet determination. Every birthday, every Father's Day, every Christmas, I gave him something handmade. A carved picture frame with hand-etched vines curling along the edges, a walnut desk box lined with velvet, a wall-mounted coat rack shaped from reclaimed oak, each hook hand-forged and polished. He always said thank you. He always set them aside. And they always disappeared. I found the coat rack once in the garage, leaning behind a stack of paint cans, still wrapped in the paper I'd tied with twine. The picture frame turned up months later in a junk drawer, filled with loose batteries and instruction manuals. The desk box sat untouched on a basement shelf, the tissue paper inside still crisp and undisturbed. Each discovery felt like a small, quiet burial. But I kept telling myself the same thing. Maybe the next one will be the one. Maybe the next one will finally make him see me. By the time I was 25, my work had evolved into something more than a hobby. I was producing custom chess sets that collectors paid hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars to own. Each piece was balanced, detailed, and carved with deliberate precision. My online following grew steadily, and I began receiving commissions from clients across the country. Strangers saw value in my work. Strangers understood the patience it demanded, the artistry it required, the hours hidden in every curve and contour. Everyone except my father. I brought a set to a family dinner once, a walnut and maple board with hand-carved knights, shaped like war horses mid-charge. I set it on the table carefully, hoping for more than the usual nod. Dad picked up a knight, turned it in his hand, and said, "That's neat, Daniel." Then he set it down and looked at Brandon. "So, how's the Henderson job going?" It happened so often that I stopped feeling surprised. I became accustomed to existing on the margins of my own family, like a background character in a story where someone else was always the hero. To his credit, Brandon never tried to compete with me. He wasn't arrogant or cruel. He simply occupied the role our father had carved out for him: the golden child, the heir to the family business, the son who carried our last name into the future with pride and purpose. I spoke a different language, one my father never bothered to learn. And still, I kept trying. Hope has a stubborn way of clinging to you, even when every piece of evidence suggests you should let it go. I told myself that my father's indifference wasn't rejection, just misunderstanding. That, one day, if I created something extraordinary enough, he would finally see what others saw. He would finally see me. So I continued carving for him. Not because he asked me to, but because I believed that love, if expressed beautifully enough, might eventually be returned. Years passed that way, quietly, steadily, marked not by arguments or confrontations, but by absence. Not of love on my part, but of recognition on his. I wasn't angry, not then. I was patient, I was hopeful. And I was wrong, because the truth was simple and brutal. I had spent my entire life auditioning for a role I was never going to be cast in. I was the overlooked son, the quiet one, the strange one with wood shavings in his pockets and stories hidden in blocks of walnut. I was the child who built things no one displayed, who earned ribbons no one hung, who spoke a language no one cared to understand. And still, year after year, I kept carving gifts for my father. Each one a silent offering, each one a prayer wrapped in wood and handed across a distance that never seemed to close, until the day I decided to create something impossible to ignore. Something that would contain not just my skill, but my history, my love, my identity, something worthy of his attention, something worthy of being seen. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would lead me to the most ambitious project of my life, a project that would take 3 months to complete and a lifetime to understand. A hand-carved chess set for my father's 60th birthday. When my father's 60th birthday began to creep closer on the calendar, I knew I wanted to make him something extraordinary, something impossible to dismiss, with a nod and a thin smile. Not another picture frame or desk box that would quietly disappear into a drawer. This time, I wanted to create something that demanded to be seen. So, I decided to build the most ambitious piece of my life, a hand-carved chess set. Not just any chess set, but one that carried the story of our family within it. A tribute not only to my craft, but to the people who shaped me, the ones who had seen me, and the ones who never truly had. I began with the king. I modeled him after my grandfather, Walter Hayes, the man who first placed a chisel in my hand and taught me how to listen to the grain of the wood. I carved his likeness with deliberate care, the steady posture, the quiet dignity, the patient strength that had defined him. The queen became my grandmother, elegant and composed, her presence balanced and unwavering. The bishops were my parents, figures of guidance, meant to stand beside the throne. The knights were Brandon and me, sculpted as opposing riders, not in conflict but in contrast. One rode forward with confidence, shoulders squared and unyielding. The other leaned slightly inward, thoughtful, deliberate, shaped by patience rather than force. The rooks became the homes that defined our lives, our childhood house, and my grandfather's cabin, fortresses of memory, carved from solid walnut. And the pawns, 12 in all, were fashioned as tools: hammers, saws, chisels, and wrenches, each one distinct, representing the trades and skills upon which our family had built its identity. It was more than a chess set, it was our history, rendered in wood. I spent 3 months on that project. 3 months of rising before dawn and working long after midnight. My workshop filled with the scent of walnut dust and linseed oil. I shaped each piece slowly, patiently, sanding until the surfaces felt like silk beneath my fingertips. I finished them by hand with tongue oil, coaxing warmth and depth from the grain until each figure seemed alive in the glow of the workbench lamp. The board itself was built from alternating squares of walnut and maple, joined with precision mitered edges that would have made any furniture maker proud. I lined the interior of the storage box with deep burgundy velvet, cushioning each piece as if it were a relic. On the inside of the lid, I engraved a small brass plate with a simple dedication to Dad. 60 years of building things that last. Love, Daniel. When I held the finished set in my hands, it felt heavier than wood and velvet. It carried months of labor, years of longing, and a lifetime of hope. Every curve, every contour, every polished surface was a quiet plea to be seen not just as a son, but as someone worthy of recognition. This wasn't just a gift, it was an offering. It was my effort, my love, my identity carved into something tangible. It was the language I had spent my life learning, translated into a form my father could hold. I wrapped the box carefully in brown craft paper and tied it with twine, the way my grandfather had taught me to package his own handmade gifts. The simplicity of it felt honest, unpretentious, nothing flashy, nothing loud, just wood, craftsmanship, and meaning. On the night of the party, I loaded the gift into my truck and drove to my parents' house with something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the guarded, cautious kind, but the reckless, vulnerable hope that makes you feel like a child again. The kind that whispers, "This time will be different." I knew better. Of course, 32 years of quiet disappointments had taught me to temper my expectations, but as I drove through the familiar streets of my childhood, the wrapped box resting on the passenger seat beside me, I allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like to finally be seen, to finally hear him say he was proud. The house was alive with celebration when I arrived. My mother had outdone herself, streamers hung from the rafters, a bakery cake sat proudly on the dining table, and my father's favorite country songs played softly through the speakers. Neighbors, coworkers, and relatives filled the rooms with laughter and the clink of beer bottles. Brandon was there with his wife and children, already surrounded by guests eager to congratulate my father on his milestone. I greeted them with a smile, the wrapped box tucked carefully in my arms like something fragile and sacred. As the evening unfolded, I watched my father from across the room laughing, shaking hands, accepting congratulations with the quiet pride of a man who had built a life from the ground up. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that he would understand what I had made for him, that he would see not just a chess set, but the story carved within it, that he would see me. When the time came for gifts, my heart pounded with a nervous anticipation I hadn't felt since childhood. I stood there holding the box, feeling the weight of 3 months of work and a lifetime of longing resting in my hands. It was more than a present. It was everything I had ever wanted to say to my father, spoken in the only language I knew how to speak. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed he might finally hear it. The party was everything my mother believed a celebration should be: warm, generous, and just a little overdone. Streamers hung from the ceiling, a bakery cake sat proudly on the dining table, and a playlist of my father's favorite country songs drifted through the house. About 30 people filled the rooms: neighbors, contractors from job sites, cousins I hadn't seen in years. Laughter echoed off the walls, punctuated by the clink of beer bottles and the low hum of conversation. My brother Brandon stood near the center of it all with his wife, Claire, and their 2 kids. He fit effortlessly into the space, exchanging handshakes and backslaps with the men who worked alongside my father. I hovered at the edge of the room, smiling politely, the wrapped chess set resting in my hands like something sacred. I had come alone. I'd been single for about a year, which was another topic my father enjoyed revisiting. Earlier that evening, as he handed me a beer, he'd said with a grin, "You'd find yourself a girl if you put down the sandpaper once in a while." A few men chuckled. I smiled back, because that was what I'd learned to do: smile, nod, endure. When it was time for gifts, my mother gathered everyone into the living room. Dad sat in his armchair, beaming with the comfortable pride of a man surrounded by family and friends. The room quieted, expectant. Brandon went first. He handed Dad a neatly wrapped box. Inside was a watch, a Seiko, sleek and understated, the kind of gift a practical man would appreciate. Dad's face lit up instantly. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, his voice warm with approval. He slipped the watch onto his wrist, admiring it beneath the light. "Now that's a watch. My boy knows what I like." He held his arm out proudly, showing it to everyone in the room. Compliments followed, laughter rising as he turned his wrist to catch the light. Brandon smiled, modest but satisfied, and Dad clapped him on the shoulder with unmistakable pride. Then, It was my turn. The room grew quiet again as I stepped forward and placed the wrapped box in his hands. It was heavier than Brandon's gift. Solid and deliberate, Dad lifted it, surprised by its weight, and began untying the twine. The paper fell away slowly. He opened the lid. Inside lay the chess set, walnut and maple gleaming beneath the soft light, velvet lining cradling each hand-carved piece. For a moment, he simply stared. He picked up the king, turning it between his fingers, studying its detail. I watched him closely, my chest tight with hope, waiting for recognition to surface in his eyes. He set the piece back down. "Huh?" he said. A thin smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's something." He closed the lid. Then he placed the box on the table beside the cake plates and empty beer bottles, as if it were just another decoration from the party. "Who wants another beer?" he asked, already turning away. The conversation resumed. Laughter returned. Someone changed the music. Within seconds, the moment was gone, swallowed by the noise of celebration. 3 months of my life, reduced to a passing glance and a polite dismissal. I stood there for a heartbeat longer, forcing a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. No one noticed, no one asked about the set. My father continued showing off his watch, holding out his wrist to anyone who passed by. "My boy knows what I like," he repeated more than once. I stayed another hour. I made small talk. I laughed at the right moments. I thanked my mother for the food and shook hands with neighbors who congratulated my father on his milestone. From across the room, I watched the watch glint beneath the light as he raised his arm again and again, proud and unmistakably pleased. Eventually, I slipped out, unnoticed. The night air was cool as I stepped onto the driveway. I sat in my truck for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, the silence pressing in around me. I didn't cry. I was past crying about it. What I felt was something quieter, an emptiness, as though everything inside me had been hollowed out, leaving only a shell behind. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came the next morning. I returned to my parents' house the next morning to retrieve my jacket. It was early, just after 7:30, the kind of quiet, pale morning when the world feels half awake and everything seems softer than it really is. I figured I'd slip in, grab my coat from the back of the kitchen chair, maybe share a cup of coffee with my mom if she was up. In and out. Nothing complicated. I turned into the driveway and noticed the trash cans at the curb. It was garbage day. Nothing unusual about that. But as I slowed the truck, something caught my eye. A brown paper bag sat tilted on top of the recycling bin. A corner of brown craft paper peeked out from its opening, the same paper I had wrapped the chess set in. I parked without thinking and stepped out of the truck, the cold morning air biting at my skin. My legs carried me forward on their own, each step slow and deliberate, as though I were walking towards something inevitable. I reached the curb and opened the bag. There it was, the chess set, still wrapped, the twine still tied neatly around it. He hadn't even opened it again after the party. He had simply taken it from the table and thrown it away with the paper plates and used napkins. 3 months of work. Hours upon hours of carving, sanding, finishing, engraving. A family history rendered in walnut and maple. A lifetime of hope carved into wood. Sitting in the trash beside a crushed beer can and a paper plate smeared with frosting, I stood there staring at it, unable to move. The garbage truck was only a few houses away, its grinding engine echoing down the street. I could hear the hydraulic arms lifting bins, the metallic clang as they emptied, the slow, inevitable approach of something final. In less than 5 minutes, it would have been gone, compacted, buried, and forgotten. And I never would have known. I reached into the bag and lifted the box out carefully, as if it were something fragile and sacred. The weight of it settled into my hands, familiar and devastating all at once. Then, I looked up at the house, through the kitchen window. I could see my father sitting at the table, drinking his morning coffee. The sunlight caught the edge of his wrist as he raised the mug, and there it was, the watch Brandon had given him, gleaming beneath the light. He hadn't noticed me in the driveway. He sat there content, wearing the gift from the son who mattered. I stood frozen, the chess set cradled in my arms, the world strangely silent except for the distant rumble of the garbage truck. In that moment, everything became painfully clear, not in a flash of anger, not in a burst of emotion, but with a quiet, irreversible certainty. I wasn't unseen because I hadn't tried hard enough. I was unseen because he had never been looking. The realization settled over me like cold water, sharp and sobering. Years of hope, of patience, of quiet offerings placed at his feet, all of it condensed into that single image, a handmade gift resting in a trash can, while a store-bought watch gleamed proudly on his wrist. Trash can, watch, one discarded, one displayed. I placed the chess set gently in the back seat of my truck. I didn't go inside. I didn't retrieve my jacket. I didn't knock on the door or say good morning. There was nothing left to say. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The garbage truck rumbled past as I pulled away, its mechanical roar echoing in the rearview mirror. Had I arrived 5 minutes later, the chess set would have been crushed into anonymity. Just another forgotten object, swallowed by the landfill. Instead, it sat beside me in silence. I drove home without music, without thought, without emotion. The world outside the windshield blurred into a gray procession of houses and empty streets. When I reached my apartment, I carried the chess set inside and placed it on my workbench. Then I sat down on the floor beside it. I sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't punch the wall or curse his name. I simply sat in the quiet, the weight of the realization settling into my bones. That was the moment I stopped trying, not because I ran out of love to give, but because I finally understood that I had been pouring it into a container with no bottom. I never went back to my parents' house after that day. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't send a dramatic message or post something bitter on social media. I just stopped showing up. And no one noticed. I didn't disappear in a dramatic way. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no final message sent in the heat of anger. I simply stopped showing up. No more Sunday dinners, no more holidays, no more quiet presence at the edge of the room, while my father and brother spoke a language I was never invited to understand. I faded out of their lives the way I had always existed within them, quietly, without disruption. The first week, my mother called to ask if I'd be coming by for dinner. I told her I was busy with work. The following week, she called again. I said I had a commission to finish. The third week, I let the call go to voicemail. Eventually, the call slowed. She began sending texts instead, gentle, familiar messages that carried the same soft insistence she'd always used to keep the peace. Miss you, honey. Your dad's grilling steaks this weekend if you want to stop by. Let me know if you need anything. I responded politely but vaguely. Sounds good. Maybe next time. Work's been busy. I never went. About a month later, Brandon called. Hey, man, he said, his tone casual. Mom says you've been MIA. Everything cool? Yeah, I replied, just swamped with work. There was a pause, the brief silence of someone deciding whether to push further. Well, don't be a stranger, he said finally. I won't, I lied. And that was the end of it. He didn't ask again. That was Brandon's way. He cared, but not enough to be inconvenienced by it. To him, nothing seemed wrong, because nothing had ever been wrong for him. The thing that stayed with me, the thought that turned endlessly in my mind like a stone in a tumbler, was that no one asked why. No one said, Daniel, did something happen? Are you okay? No one connected the dots. No one noticed that I had left the party quietly and never returned. Because that was how invisible I had always been in that family. You can't miss what you never truly saw. About 6 weeks after my father's birthday, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. She carried a casserole, of course. Margaret Carter's answer to every emotional crisis was a 9x13 pan of chicken and rice. She sat on my couch, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt, and asked gently, What's going on, Daniel? Why haven't you been around? Are you sick? Are you in trouble? I almost told her. The words hovered on my tongue. I found the chess set in the trash. Mom. He threw it away. He didn't even open it again, but I looked at her face and knew exactly how it would unfold. She would offer that soft, pained smile. She would say, Oh, honey, I'm sure he didn't mean it that way. You know how your father is. He's just not good at expressing himself. Then she would go home and tell him I was upset. And he would roll his eyes and call me sensitive. Nothing would change. Nothing ever did. So I swallowed the truth. I'm fine, Mom, I said. Just focused on work. I've got a lot of orders coming in. I'm trying to build something here. She seemed relieved. She hugged me, told me she loved me, and left the casserole on the counter. I ate it over the next 3 days. It was good. My mother's cooking was never the problem. What I didn't tell her was that, during those 6 weeks, I had discovered something else, something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. It happened when I went to clean out my grandfather Walter's cabin. Grandpa Walter had passed away 4 years earlier, and the cabin had remained mostly untouched since then. My mother asked me to take a look at it before she and my Aunt Eleanor decided whether to sell it. I agreed without hesitation. The cabin had always felt more like home to me than any house I'd ever lived in. It smelled exactly as I remembered: cedar, dust, and time. His tools still rested on the workbench. His books lined the shelves. The light filtered through the window above the bench just as it had when he stood beside me, guiding my hands as I learned to carve. in the back of his bedroom closet. Inside an old lockbox, I found a stack of papers, letters, receipts, and faded photographs. Buried beneath them was a document I had never seen before. My grandfather's will, not the official one that had been filed with the estate, the version that left everything to my mother and Aunt Eleanor, but an earlier handwritten draft. Clipped to it was a note that read, "Updated version with Attorney August 2019. In that draft, there was a specific provision: the cabin and the 6 acres it sat on were to be left to me. Directly to me, not to the estate, not to be divided or sold, to Daniel. And beneath it, written in my grandfather's steady hand, were words I would never forget, because he is the only one who ever loved this place the way I did. And he is the only one who will take care of it." I sat on the edge of his bed and read that line 4 times. The only one who ever loved this place the way I did. My grandfather had seen me. He had seen me when no one else did. He had recognized my quiet devotion, my patience, my craft, and he had tried to ensure that the place where I learned who I was would remain mine. But somewhere between that handwritten draft and the final version of the will, that provision had disappeared. I didn't know why. I didn't know if my mother or Aunt Eleanor had convinced him to change it, if the attorney had simplified the document, or if my grandfather had altered his wishes in his final days. All I knew was that the cabin was now legally my mother's, and she was considering selling it. The discovery cracked something open inside me. It wasn't just about the chess set anymore. It was about a lifetime of being overlooked. The quiet son whose passions never counted, because they didn't come with trophies or a paycheck my father could brag about at the bar. It was about watching Brandon inherit my father's approval, while I settled for polite nods and afterthoughts. And now, the one place that had ever felt like home, the cabin where my grandfather taught me to carve, the place where someone had finally looked at me and said, "You are enough," was about to be sold. Sold so the proceeds could be divided, absorbed, and forgotten. Something shifted inside me during those weeks. I wasn't angry. I was finished. Finished performing, finished auditioning for a role I was never going to be cast in, finished believing that if I just tried harder, loved louder, carved more beautifully, someone in my family would finally turn around and say, "We see you." For the first time in my life, I stopped asking for permission to matter. Instead, I began to make a plan. Not a revenge plan. Not at first, just a plan to take care of myself, to protect the one thing my grandfather had wanted me to have. Because if Walter Hayes had intended for that cabin to be mine, then maybe, just maybe, I could still make that happen. And if my family had a problem with it, they would have to do something they had never truly done before. They would have to notice me. Something shifted in me after I found my grandfather's handwritten will. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even grief. It was something quieter, steadier, like a door opening inside my chest that I hadn't known was locked. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to earn approval from people who had never intended to give it. I stopped carving for my father. I started carving for myself. The change wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no symbolic gestures. It was simply a decision, a quiet refusal to keep living, as if my worth depended on someone else's recognition. I began to pour my energy into my work with a focus and intensity I had never allowed myself before. Until then, my online shop had been modestly successful. A few custom orders each month, occasional commissions from collectors and hobbyists, enough to pay the bills, but never enough to feel secure. I had always priced my work cautiously, afraid that if I asked for what it was truly worth, no one would buy it. That fear vanished. I redesigned my website from the ground up, investing in professional photography to showcase the detail of each piece. I refined my branding, wrote descriptions that told the story behind my work, and presented my chess sets not as hobbies, but as heirlooms. Then, I raised my prices. The first time I listed a set for $1,200, I held my breath. It sold in 3 days. I carved another and listed it for $1,500. It sold within a week. Orders began to arrive from collectors, interior designers, and enthusiasts across the country. A boutique gift shop in Asheville reached out about carrying my work on consignment. I agreed. By the second month, I was earning more from carving than I had ever made at the hardware store. It wasn't sudden wealth, but it was real, tangible, earned. Enough to quit my day job. The morning I handed in my resignation, I walked out of the store feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, the craft my father had dismissed as sandpaper and sawdust was supporting me entirely on its own. Imagine that. The thing he never saw was becoming something the world valued. I also began spending my weekends at my grandfather's cabin. My mother and Aunt Eleanor still hadn't decided whether to sell or rent it, so the property remained untouched. I still had the key Grandpa had given me years ago. On Saturday mornings, I would drive out before sunrise, unlock the door, and step into the quiet sanctuary of his workshop. The smell of cedar greeted me like an old friend. Dust motes floated in the beams of morning light. His tools remained exactly where he had left them. Resting patiently on the bench, I would run my fingers along the worn handles and feel an almost physical connection to him, as though his presence lingered in the grain of the wood. Working there grounded me. It reminded me who I was, and more importantly, who I had always been. In that space, there were no expectations, no comparisons, no silent judgments, just the steady rhythm of my hands shaping something meaningful from raw material. "Slow down," I could almost hear him say. "Let the wood tell you what it wants to be." One afternoon, on my way back from the cabin, I met Claire Bennett. She lived about a mile down the road in a small farmhouse, surrounded by a garden that looked like something out of a magazine. I had driven past her property countless times as a child, never giving it a second thought. That day, she stood by the roadside, struggling to repair a fence post knocked loose by a recent storm. I pulled over to help. It was a simple act, the kind of thing people do on quiet country roads. She thanked me with a warm smile and offered me a glass of iced tea. We ended up sitting on her porch for nearly 2 hours, talking as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the hills. Claire was a veterinarian who worked with large animals at a practice 20 minutes away. She had dark hair, kind eyes, and a way of speaking that was direct without ever feeling harsh. She listened when I spoke, not politely, not out of obligation, but with genuine interest. I told her about my carving. She told me about a horse she had saved the week before, one that everyone else had written off. We didn't talk about my family. We didn't talk about trash cans or discarded gifts. We simply talked, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. We began seeing each other regularly after that. Nothing dramatic, no sweeping gestures or cinematic declarations, just dinners, long walks, and quiet conversations that stretched late into the night. She came to the cabin one afternoon and watched me work without interrupting. After 20 minutes of silence, she said softly, "You disappear when you carve. It's like you go somewhere else. It's beautiful to watch." No one had ever said that to me before. No one had ever looked at my work and called it beautiful. I excused myself to the bathroom for a moment, pretending to wash sawdust from my hands. In truth, I needed a minute to steady myself. That single sentence carried more validation than anything I had ever received from my father. While my personal life quietly blossomed, I began researching the legal implications of my grandfather's handwritten will. I took the document to an estate attorney named Thomas Whitaker, a semi-retired lawyer who ran a small practice out of a converted Victorian house downtown. Whitaker had silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the calm demeanor of a man who had witnessed every possible variation of family conflict. He studied the document carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and made several copies. When he finished, he looked up at me with a measured expression. "This isn't just a draft," he said. "It's dated and signed, and there may be grounds to argue that the final will did not properly reflect your grandfather's intent." My pulse quickened. Whitaker pointed to a handwritten note in the margin cabin to Daniel, "Separate from estate. Discussed with Eleanor, she agrees." "If your aunt did indeed agree to this provision," he explained, "and it was later removed without proper documentation of a change in intent, you may have a legal basis to challenge the distribution." I made it clear that I wasn't trying to cheat my mother or Aunt Eleanor out of anything. My grandfather's estate included savings, investments, and the proceeds from his equipment. The cabin and its surrounding land were only part of it, but, to me, they were everything. I wanted what he had wanted, nothing more, nothing less. Whitaker warned me that estate challenges were rarely simple. They required documentation, testimony, and patience. When he asked if anyone could confirm my grandfather's intentions, one name came immediately to mind: Elliot Grayson. Elliot was my grandfather's closest friend and neighbor, a retired carpenter who had shared tools, projects, and stories with him for over 40 years. If anyone knew his wishes, it would be Elliot. I drove out to see him the following week. He lived in a modest brick house a quarter-mile from the cabin, with a workshop in the back that made mine look like a shed. At 82, Elliot was sharp-eyed and steady-handed, his voice firm with the confidence of a man who had built his life one honest piece at a time. When I told him what I had found, he nodded without surprise. "Your grandfather talked about that cabin all the time?" he said. "Said it was meant for you. Said you were the only one in the family who understood what it meant to make something with your hands. He was real clear about it." I asked if he would be willing to put that in writing or testify if necessary. He studied me for a long moment before answering. "Son," he said quietly. Walter Hayes was the best man I ever knew. If his wishes got lost in the shuffle, I'll do whatever it takes to set it right. I left his house that evening with a feeling I scarcely recognized. Not hope, I had learned to be cautious with hope. It was something steadier than that. Momentum. My business was growing. Claire was in my life. Whitaker was preparing my case. And for the first time, I wasn't building something to impress my father. I was building something for myself. Meanwhile, my family remained largely unaware. My mother still texted occasionally. Brandon sent a meme every couple of weeks. My father didn't reach out at all, not once. I had been gone from their lives for nearly 4 months, and he hadn't picked up the phone a single time. That silence told me everything I needed to know. But here's the thing about being invisible your entire life. When you finally step out of the shadows, no one sees it coming. And what was coming next? Well, no one in my family was prepared for it. Least of all my father. 5 months after my father's birthday, everything in my life began to converge in a way that felt almost scripted, as if the universe had decided it was time for the quiet son to step into the light. If you believe in karma, this is the part where you start nodding. Thomas Whitaker had been working steadily behind the scenes, gathering documentation and preparing the petition to challenge the estate distribution of my grandfather's cabin. He obtained the final will from the probate court and compared it side by side with the handwritten draft I had discovered. The discrepancy was undeniable. The official will made no mention of the cabin going to me. Instead, it lumped all assets into the estate, dividing them equally between my mother and Aunt Eleanor. But the handwritten draft, dated only 3 weeks earlier, explicitly named me as the recipient of the cabin and the surrounding 6 acres. Whitaker also uncovered something unexpected. The attorney who had prepared the final will, a man named Gentry Moss, had left behind notes referencing a phone conversation with my mother. The notation was brief but telling. Margaret called, discussed simplifying distribution, remove specific bequests, split assets equally. One phone call, with a single request. My mother had effectively erased my grandfather's specific wish that the cabin be left to me. Now, I want to be clear, it's possible she hadn't fully understood the consequences. Perhaps she believed simplifying the will would make things easier for everyone. Perhaps she thought she was being fair. But here's what troubled me. She knew my grandfather had spoken openly about his intentions. Elliot knew. Aunt Eleanor remembered. There was no reasonable way my mother didn't know that her father wanted that cabin to go to his grandson. Whether her decision was intentional or careless didn't matter. The result was the same. Whitaker filed a petition with the probate court to reopen the estate distribution. He presented the handwritten will, Elliot's sworn statement, and the attorney's notes as evidence. He warned me that my family would be notified as part of the process. I'm ready, I told him. While the legal wheels began to turn, something else happened. My business exploded. Not gradually explosively. A lifestyle blogger with nearly 2 million followers purchased one of my chess sets as a gift for her husband. She posted an unboxing video online, spending 4 uninterrupted minutes admiring the craftsmanship, turning each piece in her hands, and running her fingers along the board as if it were a work of art. The video went viral. Within a week, it had amassed over 800,000 views. My inbox flooded with orders. Collectors, designers, and enthusiasts from across the country reached out, eager to commission their own sets. I had more work than I could possibly fulfill. I created a waiting list. I expanded my pricing. And still, the demand continued to grow. 2 weeks later, a producer from a regional public television craft show contacted me. They wanted to feature my work in a segment on artisan woodworkers. I said yes. Soon after, a gallery in Asheville invited me to exhibit a collection of my pieces in their annual handmade exhibition. I said yes to that, too. Then came the email that left me staring at the screen in disbelief. A representative for a well-known actor, someone whose face had appeared in multiple blockbuster films, wanted to commission a custom chess set. The budget they quoted exceeded what I had once earned in an entire year. I accepted. Through it all, Claire remained a steady presence beside me. She never made my success about herself. She never said, "I told you so." She simply showed up, helping me organize shipments, manage my schedule, and occasionally forcing me to step away from the workshop long enough to eat a proper meal. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, she looked at me with quiet certainty. "You know you deserve all of this." "Right," I hesitated, then nodded. "I'm starting to believe that," she smiled. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere, and I refuse to date someone who doesn't know their own worth." For the record, I did not get emotional at that moment. I simply excused myself to the workshop to check on something, while my eyes happened to be a little dusty. So, there I was, my business thriving. A woman who truly saw me. A legal case in motion, and a life that finally felt intentional rather than accidental. And then my mother called, not a text this time. A call. I answered. "Daniel, we need to talk." Her voice was tight, strained with forced composure. "I received a letter from a lawyer about your grandfather's cabin," she said. "Can you explain what's going on?" I kept my voice calm. "I found a handwritten version of Grandpa's will. It states the cabin was meant for me. I took it to an attorney, and he believes there's a valid claim. That's what's going on." Silence. Then, quietly but firmly, "You can't go behind everyone's back like this. This is a family matter." I almost laughed. "A family matter," I said. "Mom, I've been gone for 5 months. Dad hasn't called me once. Brandon sends memes. You send casseroles. No one in this family has asked a single real question about my life in years. So forgive me if I don't feel the need to run major decisions past the family committee." She said nothing for a moment. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Your father is very upset," she said finally. "He says you've been distant and disrespectful." I tightened my grip on the phone. Distant, disrespectful. The man who had thrown away a 3-month labor of love without a second glance believed I was being disrespectful. The man who hadn't called me in 5 months thought I was distant. "I have to go." "Mom," I said quietly. "The lawyer will handle the legal matters. If Dad wants to speak to me, he knows my number." She said something else, but I had already lowered the phone. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Claire entered the room and sat beside me, her hand resting gently on my arm. She didn't ask questions, she simply waited. "They're going to make me the villain," I said. "Then let them." She replied softly. "You know who you are." 2 days later, Brandon called, this time. His tone was serious. "Dude, what are you doing?" he asked. "Mom's freaking out. Dad's talking about getting his own lawyer. You're really going to sue the family over a cabin?" "I'm not suing anyone," I said evenly. "I'm asking for what Grandpa wanted me to have. There's a document that proves it. There's a witness who confirms it. And there are notes from the original attorney showing the provision was removed after Mom asked to simplify the will." He was quiet for a moment. "Look," he said, "even if that's true, is it worth tearing the family apart?" And there it was. The question every family scapegoat eventually hears. Is it worth tearing the family apart? As if the family hadn't been fractured long before I found a chess set in the trash. As if years of being overlooked were less destructive than asking for what was rightfully mine. I exhaled slowly. "Brandon, I love you," I said. "But this family was torn apart a long time ago. You just didn't notice because you were always on the side holding it together." He had no answer for that. The court date was set 3 weeks later. Whitaker was confident. Elliot was prepared to testify. The documentation was solid. And for the first time in my life, I was preparing to walk into a room and demand to be seen not as the quiet son, not as the disappointment, but simply as Daniel Hayes Carter, the grandson who was loved by a man who carved, and who carved because he was loved by that man. But before the court date arrived, my father did something he hadn't done in 5 months. He came to see me, and what happened next was the conversation I had been waiting for my entire life. It was a Tuesday evening when my father finally came to see me. I was in my workshop finishing a commission, a medieval-themed chess set for a client in Portland, when I heard the familiar rumble of an engine pulling into my driveway. I didn't need to look out the window to know whose truck it was. I had grown up hearing that sound. The steady growl of my father's old Ford. The one he'd always claimed he'd drive until they buried him in it. I set down my tools, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked to the front door. Richard Carter stood on my porch looking as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, his broad shoulders squared out of habit rather than comfort. On his wrist gleamed Brandon's watch. Of course he was wearing the watch. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside without speaking. He entered slowly, his eyes scanning the room as though he were inspecting a job site. They lingered on the shelves where my chess sets were displayed, on the framed photographs of Claire and me, on the workbench dusted with walnut shavings. He didn't comment on any of it. "Sit down, Dad," I said. He lowered himself onto the couch. I took the chair across from him, the space between us heavy with everything that had never been said. He spoke first. "Your mother says you're trying to take the cabin." "I'm not trying to take anything," I replied evenly. "I'm trying to honor what Grandpa wanted." He waved his hand dismissively. "Walter was sentimental, said a lot of things in his later years. Doesn't mean they were practical. He wrote it down," I said. "He signed it. He told his neighbor. He told Aunt Eleanor. He wanted me to have the cabin. The only reason I don't already have it is because Mom called the lawyer and had it removed. His jaw tightened. Your mother was trying to keep things fair. Fair for who, I asked quietly. Because it wasn't fair for me, and it wasn't fair for Grandpa. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, pointing at me in the way he always did when he believed he was about to make an unassailable argument. Daniel, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's a cabin. It's old, needs a new roof, plumbing's shot. It's not worth what you think it is. It's worth everything to me, I said. And the fact that you can't understand that is exactly why we're here. He stared at me, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. I could see him trying to reconcile the quiet son he had known with the man sitting across from him, calm, steady, and unwilling to yield. I didn't come here to argue about a cabin, he said finally. I came because your mother is upset. Your brother is upset. And honestly, Daniel, I don't understand what's gotten into you. That was the moment I stopped holding back. You want to know what's gotten into me, I said. I'll tell you. But you need to listen. Not nod and wait for your turn to talk. Actually listen. He leaned back, crossing his arms, the universal language of reluctant tolerance. I spent 3 months building you a chess set for your 60th birthday, I continued. Every piece was hand-carved. The king was modeled after Grandpa Walter. The board was walnut and maple. I engraved a brass plate on the lid. It was the finest thing I've ever made. He blinked, his brow furrowing as though trying to summon a distant memory. You opened it at the party, I said. You said, huh, that's something. Then you set it aside and spent the rest of the night showing off the watch Brandon bought you. He shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, I said thank you. You said, huh, that's something. I met his gaze steadily, and the next morning, I came back to get my jacket and found the chess set in the trash can at the curb, still wrapped. You threw it away, Dad. You didn't even give it to Goodwill or shove it in the basement. You put it in the garbage with the used paper plates. The room fell silent. I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, defensiveness, and then something I had never seen there before, shame. I didn't know, he said quietly. Your mother was cleaning up. I thought it was, I don't know, decorations or something someone brought. It had a brass plate that said, to Dad on it, I replied. He closed his eyes. For the first time in my life, I saw my father confronted with something he could not dismiss. The evidence was too clear. The hurt was too real. And I was sitting in front of him, no longer flinching, no longer apologizing for existing. I messed up, he said softly. Yeah, I replied. You did. Not just with the chess set. With every carving I ever brought home that you ignored. Every ribbon I won that you never hung. Every conversation you steered back to Brandon while I was still speaking. You spent my entire life telling me in 1,000 small ways that I didn't matter. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat there, absorbing the truth. And when I finally stopped showing up, I continued. You didn't even notice for 5 months. His shoulders sagged, the weight of my words settling into him. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I don't know if you can, I said quietly. But I know what's going to happen with the cabin. That property is going to come to me because that's what Grandpa Walter wanted. I have the paperwork, I have the witnesses, and I'm going to restore it. I'm going to fix the roof, the plumbing, the porch. I'm going to turn it into my workshop because that's where I learned who I am. I paused, letting the words settle. And the man I am is someone worth knowing. Dad, you just never bothered to find out. He stood slowly, his gaze drifting to the shelves where my chess sets were displayed. His eyes lingered on them, studying the details, the precise carving, the patient craftsmanship, the quiet devotion etched into every piece. These are beautiful, he said. The words were heavy, raw, as though they cost him something to speak. For a moment, I almost believed he meant them. Thank you, I replied. You can let yourself out. He hesitated, as if searching for something more to say. But no words came. Instead, he nodded once and walked toward the door. I stood at the window and watched his truck pull away, the fading rumble of the engine echoing down the street. Claire emerged from the bedroom where she had been giving us space. She wrapped her arms around me from behind, her presence warm and steady. How are you? She asked softly. I exhaled, feeling a calm I had never known before. I'm good, I said. I'm actually really good. For the first time in my life, I hadn't asked for my father's approval. I had simply told him the truth, and that was enough. 3 weeks later, we stood in probate court. Thomas Whitaker presented the handwritten will with steady precision. Elliot Grayson testified with quiet conviction, recounting decades of friendship with my grandfather and his repeated declarations that the cabin was meant for me. The attorney's notes were entered into evidence, confirming the removal of the specific bequest after my mother's call. The facts spoke clearly. My Aunt Eleanor, to my genuine surprise, testified in support of my claim. She remembered my grandfather's intentions and admitted she had never objected to the provision. Her honesty shifted the tone of the courtroom, dissolving what little resistance remained. The judge ruled in my favor. The cabin and the 6 acres of land were transferred to my name. Just like that, it was done. Outside the courtroom, my mother wept quietly in the hallway. Brandon stood beside her, hands in his pockets, uncertain and subdued. My father was not there. He had chosen not to attend. I felt no triumph, only a steady sense of rightness, as though something long misplaced had finally been returned. A week later, a package arrived in the mail. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a framed photograph I had never seen before. I was 12 years old, standing at my grandfather's workbench, holding up a small carved bird with a grin that stretched across my entire face. Behind me stood my grandfather, one hand resting proudly on my shoulder. On the back of the frame, in my father's handwriting, were 6 simple words I should have paid more attention. I placed the photograph on my workbench at the cabin, exactly where my grandfather would have wanted it. It has been a year since all of that happened. The cabin is restored now, new roof, updated plumbing, a proper workshop with lighting and ventilation worthy of the craft practiced within its walls. I spend most of my days there, shaping walnut and maple into forms that carry stories of patience and purpose. Claire and I moved into her farmhouse down the road. Loving a veterinarian, it turns out, means sharing your home with 3 rescue dogs and a cat named Hank, who observes everything from the highest possible surface with quiet judgment. I proposed to her on the cabin porch at sunset. She said yes before I could finish the question. My business is thriving. There's a 6-month waiting list for commissions, 2 additional media features after the craft show, and a partnership with a national retailer to produce a limited collection of heirloom chess sets. The chess set I made for my father, the one I pulled from the trash rests on a table beside the workshop window. I never sold it. It remains there, not as a reminder of what he did, but as a testament to what I am worth. As for my family, things remain complicated. My mother and I speak occasionally. She is trying, in her quiet way, to mend what was broken. Brandon and I meet for a beer from time to time. He still doesn't fully understand, but he is making the effort. And my father, we are not close. We may never be, but 2 months ago, he visited the cabin. He didn't say much. He walked through the workshop slowly, studying the tools, the benches, the sets displayed along the walls. He watched me carve for a while in silence. Before he left, he placed his hand on my shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. That was all. For Gerald Carter, it was more eloquent than any apology. I don't need his approval anymore. For 34 years, I carved things for a man who couldn't see them. Now I carve for myself, for Claire, for clients who appreciate the work, and for the memory of a grandfather who looked at a quiet boy holding a block of wood and said, "Show me what you see in there." Every single day, I still do. And now, finally, the world sees it too. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to Fish Tells Stories for more powerful Reddit family dramas about resilience, healing, and self-worth. This story was created by the Fish Tells Stories team for entertainment purposes only. Please do not imitate or apply it in real-life situations.